Hi, I'm Eric Herman. I'm an optical design engineer at Zygo Electro-Optics in Irvine, California. I've been designing optical systems for over 10 years. Throughout my career, I've worked on various medical optics in different stages of design and manufacturing. I'm going to be talking today about managing programs for medical optics. Before we get started, if you have questions during this presentation, please ask them in the chat window. We will try to address these questions either in the chat throughout or at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time before we answer your questions, we'll follow up with you afterwards. Also, after this webinar, we will be sent a brief survey. A link to this survey will also be sent in a follow-up email that you should receive tomorrow. While you might think of Zygo solely as a metrology company, we do more than make interferometers. Our interferometers are one segment of the work we do. Along with our interferometers, we also make extremely precise measurement devices, manufacture cutting-edge optical components, and develop and produce high-performance optical systems. Specifically in Irvine, we work on developing and manufacturing a wide variety of optical systems. We work from the initial engineering of a product all the way through to full-scale production. Some of these systems are used for space-based imaging, semiconductor manufacturing, and applicable to our talk today, a variety of systems used in the medical industry. One thing I hope you'll take away from this webinar is what to consider when making an optical system specific for a medical application. Understanding that will help determine what to worry about during the design process. After determining what differentiates a medical optic, I'll go through the process of taking a system from concept to full-scale production. Understanding this process and some of the pitfalls along the way may help in development of your medical device. You should also learn when in your device development to bring in a supplier. You want to make sure the partnership you develop with your supplier will give you the highest rate of success. The first thing we need to talk about when thinking of medical optics is how are these systems different from other industries. For medical optics, you'll find two major categories, imaging and interaction or illumination. Optical systems that provide imaging may be used for diagnostics such as X-ray imaging, retinal imaging, and optical coherence tomography or OCT. Retinal imaging may be used to help diagnose glaucoma, and OCT may be used to diagnose malignant tumors. Additionally, there are a variety of microscopes that are used during surgery to assist a doctor. A couple of examples are 3D microscopes and fluorescent microscopes. The fluorescent microscopes are used to highlight specific markers and clearly show tumors during surgery. We may also see optics used in dental applications. Some of these systems are used to map a tooth that could then be used to help make a crown. When dealing with interaction or illumination optical systems, you'll typically see a laser device that's attached to the optic. These may be used for cutting or shaping in surgery. A key example of this is using lasers to perform LASIK surgery. In that instance, a laser is used to cut part of the cornea and improve vision. We might also see lasers used for aesthetic surgeries. Lasers are integrated with optical systems for tattoo removal, wrinkle reduction, and skin resurfacing or rejuvenation. In all cases, when using lasers in medical optics, the type of laser is important to think about. As lasers may be either pulsed or constant, different applications may require one type of laser over the other. When specifically dealing with pulse lasers, the wavelength, pulse duration, and the laser energy will need to be considered. For the case of a CW laser, only the wavelength and power will need to be considered. Zygo has worked on a wide variety of optical systems used in medical devices. we have taken many different designs from concept all the way through to full-scale production. A highlight of these systems are shown here. These optical systems are used across the medical industry, and many are still in use today. As with all technologies, medical optics are being continuously improved with new technology. In recent years, we've seen detectors have larger areas and reduced pixel sizes. When using the same optical system with larger detectors, you will see an increase in the field of view. Decreasing the pixel size with the same optical system will allow an increase in the resolution. Improvements in the laser field have been driven by technologies used in ophthalmology. An example is the development of faster femtosecond lasers for use in cataract surgeries. We've also seen lasers being used to excite specific neurons in the brain and assist doctors with brain surgery. The use of computational biophotonics with optical systems allows a more data-driven approach in medical applications. These types of systems can provide a more meaningful result with the data collected and reduce the complexity of the optic itself. Along with the technologies that directly impact medical optics, there have been advances across all optical fields. These have been driven by manufacturing and testing capabilities. The use of freeform and diffractive surfaces have allowed optical systems to decrease element count as well as decrease package size. When you start to develop an optical system in the medical field, one of the most important things you should know early on is that you won't get many chances to iterate through the design. In many cases, once the optical system is approved, you're pushed to deliver a product. Once you receive approvals, both within your own company and from the government, that design is effectively fixed in place. Going back and trying to change any aspect of the design may be extremely difficult. With that in mind, you need to make sure the design will meet your requirements upfront and shouldn't need to change. Across all optical fields, one of the most important things to do upfront is go through your signal chain analysis. This process looks at the entire optical system to determine what requirements are needed for each subsystem of the device. In the case of imaging systems, you will first analyze the radiometric properties of the object or source and what output is needed from the device. You then may consider only the detector as a subsystem. The size of the detector and the pixel pitch drive the field of view and the resolution. Additionally, the noise from the detector may impact your final radiometric output. It's then important to choose the right detector. In the case of medical optics, the detector choice may be driven solely on the size of the detector and pixel pitch. Between the detector and your source, an optical system specification will be developed. These will include the performance requirements for the optics based on the entire system needs. In many cases, post-processing of an image will be done. An example of this is distortion correction. In these cases, an optical system can achieve a certain distortion threshold. Further corrections will still need to be done, and those will be done through software. Starting with the design requirements, care must be taken when considering the end use. As most medical optics will be used with a patient, understanding interactions and requirements with the body is critical. Since the optical system in question will have to go through government compliance, knowing what is unacceptable for human usage is important. It's also necessary to understand the difference between a want and a need for your system. Having wants as necessary requirements may drive different design forms. This may add unnecessary cost and drag out schedule for both the system design and fabrication. Once you have your requirements in place, it's necessary to specify what your end acceptance metric will be. When dealing with imaging systems, a test such as MTF, where you are measuring the resolution, may provide the appropriate feedback. When using MTF as an acceptance metric, integration of a detector will typically be necessary. The image that is output onto your computer will then be analyzed to confirm the resolution. In cases of illumination, using an encircled energy test will be more important. The encircled energy of an optical system will determine how well a laser is illuminating through the device. It may also be necessary to have a stand-in requirement. When performing an MTF or encircled energy test is too complex, it may be better to determine the RMS wavefront error. Even though the RMS wavefront error may not be the key figure of merit, it may provide enough feedback as an acceptance test. When starting the design of a medical optic, if the technology isn't fully fleshed out, performing the R&D may still be necessary. If this is the case, it may be best to not perform this R&D with a supplier. It may be better to use either in-house engineering or outside consultants to validate the technology. The role of your supplier is to bring your device into reality, not to help in developing the science. Working with a supplier too early may incur larger costs than necessary. Once the R&D has been completed, this is the time to start to involve a supplier. Having the concept solidified will allow you to move forward with that supplier, actively getting feedback on the realities of your medical device. By including your supplier early on, some pitfalls may be mitigated. While the initial R&D may have been done on breadboards, this is not the same as a finished product. The supplier may suggest design changes to desensitize the tolerances on the optic. This may determine the manufacturing methods you can use. Your supplier may also determine aspects of your system that aren't physically manufacturable at production scale. When looking for a supplier for your medical optics, there are certain traits you must look for. One thing that a supplier needs to have is process control. For many people, the supplier's process control will follow the ISO 9001 standard. When dealing with medical optics, a higher level of process control is needed. ISO 13485 is a process control standard specifically for medical devices. Additionally, your supplier should be aware of what manufacturing needs are acceptable for medical applications. This may be as simple as using latex-free gloves in fabrication and assembly. You also want to make sure your supplier considers the acceptable materials that are used in your medical device. As adhesives are frequently used in optical systems, understanding which adhesives are medical grade is critical. If process flow or material considerations are not followed, the results may be catastrophic. When looking at the optical design of your medical device, you first need to make sure that your design meets requirements. It's key to understand that the nominal design will almost always have the best performance you can achieve. Leaving margin on requirements will allow a finished system to achieve the necessary performance. It's also important to start looking at the acceptance testing early. In some cases, designing and building a test bench may be more difficult and complex than the optical system itself. Starting this process early on will help to reduce schedule slips. Tolerancing is key to the optical design process. Determining tolerances for an optic will drive what manufacturing methods may be used for production. Some manufacturers may not be able to achieve your desired tolerances, leaving you with a finished product that is not compliant. The manufacturing considerations are also critical to the design process. As is the case for many systems, cost may be the driver for your final product. The choice of glass type for each of the lenses may be a cost driver when going into production. Each type of glass has a different raw material cost. Some of these raw materials may be as much as 15 times more costly than others. You also want to be aware of melt frequency of each glass type. For some glasses, they aren't melted very frequently and may be harder to come by. This may be an even bigger issue if a glass type will be obsolete soon. In that case, you may not be able to keep getting the raw glass that you need for your design. You should also consider the aspect ratio for an individual element. This is the ratio of the diameter to the center thickness. A small aspect ratio will mean that your lens is fat compared to the diameter. This will require a thicker piece of glass for manufacturing. On the other end, if you have a large aspect ratio, your manufacturer will need to be comfortable with mounting and holding a thinner optic at the edge. Remember, tolerancing an optical system is critical. Knowing the sensitivity of the optic will drive the tolerances. If it's necessary to have tight tolerances, cost may be considered along with the performance requirements. The balance of cost versus technical needs will drive certain aspects of the device. If an optical system needs to have extremely low cost with loose tolerances, knowing this upfront will drive the design. An example of this is the use of A-spheres in a design. While A-spheres may greatly improve the performance, the cost of manufacturing an A-sphere may be larger than the allowable budget. Knowing how your system will be manufactured and built is key. For some optical systems, the tolerances will allow a loose assembly process. This may allow each of your lenses to be placed into a housing, taking only the manufacturing tolerances from the optics and mechanics into consideration. In other cases, the manufacturing tolerances may be tight and drive the build process. An example of this is an optical system requiring a lot of hands-on time to properly align each of the lenses. When starting to look at large volumes of medical devices, you may consider using molded optics or cast metal housings. While these types of manufacturing methods will bring down the individual lens or housing costs, you must remember that there is an extremely large upfront cost in making each of the molds. Once your optical system has been built and aligned, your acceptance tests will be performed. This will show that your device meets your requirements. Knowing what your tests are is necessary. Performing the acceptance test may be extremely complex. Some test setups may require more engineering than the device itself. Understanding what is needed for your final acceptance test is key. Because determining certain figures of merit may be extremely complex, you should start on test and measurement systems early. This is to both make sure that your design can be tested and will meet your schedule needs. You don't want to have a finished product waiting for your test and measurement system. Also, understanding what acceptance criteria is a want versus a need is important. Some tests may be important early in the prototype phase, but may be too cumbersome later on. After your first optical systems have been built, going through a prototype analysis is key. You need to validate that your optical system meets the full set of requirements. When doing this, you'll be able to determine if the initial requirements you set and designed against are achievable. Being able to have a hands-on feel of the optical system may bring out details you missed during the design phase. One thing to remember is that the scale of a system may have been considered differently during the design versus how it is in reality. If you are working with an optical system that's small, an endoscope for example, you may not realize how difficult it will be to assemble and test your device. In the case where a device needs to be sealed, you need to make sure there is the possibility for potential rework if the manufacturing or alignment isn't meeting the requirements. This rework might be for the initial build or for servicing later in the field. Remember, most medical optics are fixed at the end of the design phase. If you're able to have a prototype run and see what worked and what didn't, you may be able to adjust your design accordingly. You may not get another chance to fix errors in the device design. After you've received all approvals, scaling up your manufacturing is necessary. For some suppliers, the fabrication methods used will not be conducive to high volume production. You need to make sure that the suppliers you work with can achieve the necessary production quantities and schedule. For some medical optics, the per unit cost or quantities may require changes to the manufacturing process. In terms of raw material, going from strip glass to glass pressings may reduce the cost of each individual lens. In that case, the glass pressing is formed to a closer starting shape of the lens element. This means you are minimizing polish time. The drawback of glass pressings is that you may start to see refractive index changes that wouldn't have been present otherwise. Thinking about these manufacturing methods early in the design will allow an easier shift in production. You don't want to try to scale up to production levels with a design that requires more attention to detail than possible. It's important to ensure your supplier has a robust supply chain. If there are problems with the supply chain, it may slow down production or require unnecessary cost increases. One way of potentially avoiding supply chain issues may be to have a secondary source. When doing this, you're giving yourself a bit more security in receiving your lenses. If you start to see issues from one supplier, having that secondary source may give you a nice safeguard. When using a secondary source, it's also important to understand that each supplier will have their own upfront costs. The upfront costs for tooling, and then subsequently the cost for each individual lens, may be increased because of the lower quantities. Wrapping up, I've covered the process of bringing a medical optic from an initial design up through full-scale production. I've tried to highlight key things to pay attention to along the way. You want to remember that you should work with your supplier early on. Being collaborative through the design process will give you the highest chance for success. Make sure you take manufacturing considerations into your design process. Going back and changing your design after you've received approvals can be extremely difficult. You also want to make sure that you consider your test and measurement system early on. Some acceptance tests may involve more complexity than your optical system itself. Starting on the test and measurement system early will allow you to mitigate having a completed optic waiting on the shelf to get tested. I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join. This webinar will be posted later on Zygo's YouTube channel and our website. Are there any questions?
Hey, Eric, this is Joe. I don't see any questions in our queue, but our contact information is there. So if anybody has a question after this webinar, please contact Eric and I, and we'll be happy to get back with you.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar. And look to zygo.com for future webinars.